Welcome, dear listeners, to Aura Tales Triumph. Before we step into tonight's world, I'd love to know, where is the sun setting for you right now? Are you in the historic streets of Virginia or Massachusetts, the vibrant energy of Lagos, or the mist-covered hills of Scotland? Perhaps you're watching from Texas, Toronto, or somewhere quiet under the stars. Let us know in the comments. And if you find yourself drawn to slow-burn romances, stories of tension, vengeance, and secrets whispered by candlelight, do subscribe and become part of our growing tale. Now, settle in. The chandeliers of Whitmore Hall had witnessed many things: treaties sealed with handshakes, fortunes lost over card tables, and more than a few hearts quietly broken beneath their golden light. But they had never witnessed anything quite like this. A young duke standing rigid as carved marble, while his grandmother's jeweled hand pressed into his shoulder like a brand, and three eligible young women behind them, watching with the polite horror of people who already knew they had been refused. Lawrence Everett Calloway, the Duke of Crestmore, had not always been made of stone. There was a version of him, buried beneath years of ledgers and duty, who had once believed in warmth. But that version had died quietly the morning he turned 17 and discovered exactly what a man's open heart could cost. In debts unpaid, in staff dismissed, in winter fires that could no longer be lit because sentiment had swallowed the coal budget. His father had loved extravagantly. His father had also left Lawrence an estate teetering on the edge of ruin. And so Lawrence had learned to refuse, systematically, brilliantly, even cheerfully, in the way only a man completely certain of himself could manage. 14 refusals in a single season, a record that had made him simultaneously the most talked about and least pursued bachelor in the ton. Mothers warned their daughters, daughters warned each other. Even the matchmakers, women who had once tamed dukes far more feral than he, had crossed his name from their lists with the quiet acceptance of professionals who recognized an impossible commission. He had considered this a victory. He had been wrong. "You imagine," said the Dowager Duchess of Crestmore, her voice carrying the particular softness of someone who no longer needed volume to command a room, "you imagine that your refusals belong to you. They do not. They never did." Lawrence turned, slowly, to face the woman who raised him when grief had made his father useless, the woman who taught him to read a balance sheet at age 9 and to bow with dignity at age 10, in that order, because she believed dignity was worth more than literacy. The dowager was dressed in deep emerald velvet, her white hair swept into a crown that needed no actual coronet to make its point. She wore the expression she reserved for announcements that had already been decided. His chest tightened. In 31 years he had learned that particular expression meant the floor was about to shift. "Grandmother, there is a letter," she said, and produced an envelope so aged its edges had begun to feather. "Signed the year your father turned 22, before the losses, before the deaths, before you." She placed it into his hands with the precision of someone handing over a detonator. "It is an agreement, Lawrence, between this family and one other, and it carries a clause." He read it once, then again, because the first reading had clearly been in error. It was not in error. The clause was simple, devastating in the way that only legal language could achieve, stripped of all sentiment, leaving only consequence. If the current Duke of Crestmore remained unmarried beyond his 31st year, a controlling interest in the Crestmore estate would transfer, legally and irrevocably, to the Caldwell family trust, not as punishment, as a fulfillment.
His father had signed this. His father had smiled while signing this, no doubt, because his father had been in love that week with someone entirely unsuitable and believed love made men invincible. Lawrence lowered the letter. Behind him, he heard the soft rustle of 3 young women in white, shifting their weight in unison, watching him with the careful attention of people who sensed that history was being made and were not entirely sure whether to feel sorry for him. "Your birthday," the Dowager Duchess said, "is in 4 weeks." The chandeliers burned on above them, indifferent and golden, as Lawrence R. Calloway, a man who had spent a decade refusing every door, felt the last exit seal behind him. The price of his freedom, it turned out, was exactly what he had always refused to pay.
The first thing Lawrence Everett Calloway did every morning, before the fire was lit and before his valet had finished drawing the curtains, was review the estate ledgers. Not because he enjoyed it, because someone had to. His father had enjoyed things, sunsets, dancing, the company of women who laughed too loudly for drawing rooms and not loudly enough for stages. His father had enjoyed himself thoroughly and consistently for 43 years, and the bill for all that enjoyment had landed with surgical precision on Lawrence's desk the morning after the funeral. £300,000 in undisclosed debts, 2 mortgaged parcels of farmland, 1 very confused solicitor who kept clearing his throat as though preparing to deliver worse news that never quite arrived. Lawrence had cleared every debt in 11 years. He had done it through discipline, through silence, and through the complete abolition of anything resembling personal indulgence. No unnecessary entertainments, no costly renovations beyond structural necessity, no women, because women, in his studied observation, had a way of making otherwise sensible men sign things. The Ton had named him the Duke of Granite somewhere around his 4th season, when it became apparent that his refusals were not shyness, not selectivity, but policy. He had heard the name and found it acceptable. Granite did not crack. Granite did not sign anything it had not read 3 times. He was reading the October accounts when his grandmother arrived. She did not knock. The Dowager Duchess Anna P. Calloway had built this house in the sense that she had outlasted everyone else in it, and she treated its rooms accordingly, as extensions of herself, entered at will. "You refused the Hartwell girl," she said, settling into the chair across from him, with the unhurried authority of someone who had been sitting in chairs longer than most people had been alive. I giggled at my own sentences. "She has 40,000 a year." "Then she can afford to giggle." Lawrence did not look up. "I also refused Miss Pemberton and the elder Ashby daughter, if you are compiling a list." "I am." Anna folded her hands in her lap. 14 this season alone." He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the ledger did not already say better. Then she placed the envelope on his desk. He looked at it. Aged paper, wax seal long since cracked, his father's handwriting on the front in the loose, romantic scrawl of a man who believed penmanship, like everything else, should feel effortless. "What is this?" "The price," Anna said quietly, "of every refusal you have ever made." The fire crackled behind her. Outside, October pressed grey and indifferent against the windows. Lawrence reached for the envelope with the steady hands of a man who had taught himself never to flinch, and read the document that would dismantle everything he had built. He found her on a ladder. This was not, Lawrence reflected, how one typically encountered a woman one was about to propose to. There were conventions for these things, parlors, chaperones, a carefully orchestrated exchange of pleasantries over tea that meant nothing and committed no one to anything. There was an entire social architecture built precisely to ensure that first impressions arrived prearranged and properly lit.
Lady Mary D. Mackintosh was 14 rungs up a library ladder, her back to the door, cataloguing the upper shelf of the Crestmore archives with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be interrupted. She wore no jewelry. Her dark hair was pinned up in the practical manner of a woman who needed her hands free. A pencil was tucked behind her left ear. She was reading the spine of a ledger with the kind of attention most people reserved for love letters. Lawrence stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "The third volume of the Crestmore Land Surveys," she said without turning, "has been misfiled under household accounts since approximately 1791. I have also found 2 deeds that your solicitor believes no longer exist." She descended the ladder with calm efficiency, turned, and looked at him with grey eyes that assessed him the way she had just assessed the shelf, methodically, without flattery, cataloguing what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be. "You must be the Duke." "I must be," Lawrence agreed. She gestured to the reading table, where a remarkable quantity of documents had already been sorted into columns that suggested a governing logic he did not yet understand. "Shall we sit?" They sat. No tea appeared. Lawrence found, to his mild surprise, that he did not miss it. "I assume," Lady Mary said, opening a small notebook, "that your grandmother has explained the terms of the blood oath." She said blood oath the way other people said quarterly review, as a fact to be processed, not a drama to be inhabited. "I have. I assume you find the arrangement as disagreeable as I do." Lawrence paused. "I find it inconvenient." "Then we agree on something." She made a small note. "I have conditions, Your Grace, not many and none unreasonable. I will not be managed, monitored, or redirected from my work in the archives. I require my own correspondence to remain private, and I will not pretend for the benefit of the ton or anyone else that this is something it is not." Lawrence studied her for a long moment. In 31 years no woman had ever sat across from him and opened with conditions. He found, against every reasonable expectation, that he respected it enormously. "Agreed," he said. Lady Mary closed her notebook. "Then I believe we understand each other." They did not, of course, but it was, Lawrence would later think, a remarkably honest place to begin.
It rained on the morning of the wedding, which Lawrence considered neither a bad omen nor a good one, but simply weather behaving with appropriate honesty about the occasion. The ceremony was held in the Crestmore family chapel, a narrow stone building that had witnessed 4 generations of silver marriages with the impassive patience of very old architecture. It seated 60, 31 attended. The flowers had been arranged by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pollitt, who had done her competent best with late-season roses that had already begun, quietly and without drama, to lose their petals. Lawrence stood at the altar in charcoal wool, his posture the architectural equivalent of the building itself, load-bearing, precise, giving nothing away. He watched Lady Mary walk the aisle on the arm of a distant uncle who seemed equally uncertain about the proceedings. She wore ivory, simply cut, with no train to complicate the practical matter of walking. No veil obscured her face. She looked, Lawrence thought, exactly like a woman who had read the terms of a contract and arrived to sign it with her eyes open. Which was, he reminded himself, precisely what this was. The vicar spoke the words. They repeated them. The register was signed. Lady Mary's handwriting, he noticed involuntarily, was exceptionally precise. And then it was finished, and they were married, and the chapel exhaled around them like a room relieved to have completed an obligation. The wedding breakfast was efficient. The dowager raised a glass and said something gracious that committed her to nothing. A handful of guests made conversation with the determined cheerfulness of people aware that their cheerfulness was doing significant structural work.
Lady Mary ate with composure and spoke when spoken to with the measured warmth of someone who had decided at some prior point not to waste animation on rooms that had not yet earned it. Lawrence said very little. This surprised no one. By 4 o'clock, the guests had dispersed into the grey afternoon, and Crestmore Manor received its new Duchess with the silent neutrality of a house that had learned not to form attachments. It was Lawrence himself who raised the matter of arrangements in the East Corridor with the directness he applied to all logistical questions. "The West Wing has been prepared for your use," he said. "Your workroom adjoins the archive hall. I have had a separate key cut." Lady Mary received this information without blinking. "Thank you." "My own apartments are in the East Wing. We are unlikely to inconvenience each other." "No," she agreed, "we are not." They regarded each other briefly in the corridor's half-light, two people who had negotiated something without quite naming what they had lost in the negotiation, and then turned with perfect composure in opposite directions. The manor settled around them, quiet, orderly, cold as January stone.
Lady Mary had a system. Most people, in her experience, did not understand this about archives, that disorder was never random. Every misfiled document, every missing ledger, every date that did not quite align with the dates surrounding it told a story about the person who had arranged the disorder. Chaos, properly read, was its own form of confession. She had been working through the Crestmore blood oath documentation for 11 days when she found the first confession. It was a correspondence file tucked beneath a stack of agricultural surveys dated 1798 in a section of the archive that had no business containing correspondence at all. Someone had placed it there deliberately, with the particular care of a person hiding something in plain sight, banking on the reasonable assumption that no one would ever look carefully enough to find it. Lady Mary looked carefully at everything. She drew the file out, set it flat on the reading table beneath the window's grey afternoon light, and began. The letters were between two parties, one identified only by a solicitor's reference number, the other by a seal she recognized after a moment's consideration as belonging to Lord Ashford of the Hadley estate. The dates ran across a 14-month period, ending 6 weeks before the blood oath had been presented to the Dowager Duchess. She read the first letter twice, then the second. By the third she had retrieved her notebook and was writing in the compressed, rapid hand she used when her thoughts were moving faster than was entirely comfortable. The blood oath bore 2 witness signatures. She had noted them at first reading without particular attention. Witnesses were procedural, their presence administrative. But the letters referenced those witnesses by name, and the letters described, in the measured, euphemistic language of men who believed themselves too intelligent to be understood, exactly what those witnesses had been paid to sign. Lady Mary set down her pencil. Lord Ashford, and beside him, present in every third letter with the quiet consistency of a man who preferred other people to hold the pen, Baron Whitmore. The signatures on the blood oath were not witnesses to a legitimate debt. They were the architects of one that had never existed, a legal fiction constructed with enough period-accurate paperwork to survive casual scrutiny, designed to hold until the Crestmore estate had no remaining option but to fracture along the lines its authors had pre-drawn. She sat for a long while in the silence of the archive, the letters arranged before her in chronological order, the full shape of it becoming clearer with each passing minute. Then she closed the file carefully, placed it beneath the false bottom of her document case, a precaution that now felt, in retrospect, entirely necessary, and sat very still. She needed to tell Lawrence. The question, she was already beginning to understand, was whether Lawrence would believe her. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, Lady Mary would later think, a very deliberate choice of day. Mondays carried urgency, Wednesdays suggested mid-week calculation, but Tuesday was unremarkable, a day designed to receive things without attracting attention to the receiving.
Whoever had sent it understood the grammar of discretion. It came addressed in a clean, anonymous hand, sealed with unmarked wax, and delivered not through the main house post, which Mrs. Pollet sorted each morning at the hall table with the thoroughness of a woman who considered correspondence her secondary jurisdiction, but slipped directly beneath the archive door some time before 6 o'clock, when the corridor was still dark and the house had not yet committed itself to wakefulness. Lady Mary found it when she arrived at 6:30, as she always did. She read it standing, without sitting down, because something in the weight of the envelope had already told her it was not the kind of letter one settled in for. It was brief, professionally so. The author did not introduce themselves, did not explain their knowledge of the archive's contents, and did not waste a single word on pleasantries. They knew she had found something, they knew its value, and they were prepared to offer her £10,000, transferred discreetly, documented as a private inheritance should anyone inquire, in exchange for the file being returned to its original location and her investigation quietly concluded. £10,000, more than most men earned in a decade, enough to purchase complete independence, a modest property, and the freedom to work without the complication of a cold-winged marriage to a man who had never once looked at her as though she were a person rather than an arrangement. Lady Mary read it a second time. Then she folded it with precision, placed it in her document case beside the Ashford correspondence, and went back to work. She did not notice Lawrence in the corridor. He had not intended to be there. He rose early as habit, walked the East Passage before breakfast as a matter of routine, and had simply been passing the archive when the strip of lamplight beneath the door told him she was already inside. He had paused, not eavesdropping, he would tell himself later, simply pausing, and through the gap that the old door had never quite learned to close, he had seen, at an angle that revealed just enough and explained nothing, his wife reading a letter with an expression he could not name. Then, watching her fold it and lock it away, quickly and carefully, with the deliberate movements of a woman concealing something she did not wish found. Lawrence walked on to breakfast. He ate without tasting anything, the ledger open beside his plate, his eyes moving across the columns without reading them. 11 years of managing risk had taught him that instinct, rigorously examined, was simply pattern recognition wearing informal clothes. The pattern, this morning, made his jaw tighten.
The parcel arrived 3 days later, and Lawrence was waiting for it. Not obviously, he had not stationed himself at the door like a man who had surrendered his composure to suspicion. He had simply informed Hargrove, the house steward, with the measured casualness of someone making a minor administrative adjustment, that all parcels addressed to the West Wing were to be brought to his study first for estate logging purposes. Hargrove had accepted this without expression, because Hargrove had spent 14 years accepting Lawrence's instructions without expression, and was not about to develop opinions now. The parcel was slim, wrapped in brown paper, and bore a banking-house stamp from a London firm Lawrence did not recognize. It was addressed to Lady Mary, in that same clean, anonymous hand. He told himself he opened it because it was his estate, his house, his name on every deed and mortgage instrument in the county. He told himself that a man who had rebuilt a ruined inheritance brick by careful brick had not only the right but the responsibility to know what financial instruments were moving through his own correspondence. He told himself these things with great conviction, and opened the parcel and found inside a private banking record, deposits, dates, account notations that made the air in his study go very still. 3 deposits, the first predating their marriage by 2 weeks, the second arriving the week Lady Mary had begun working through the blood oath documentation, the third, most recent, recorded 4 days ago.
The account bore no name he recognized, but the deposit notations carried a reference code that, when laid beside the solicitor's numbering from the Ashford letters he had once glimpsed in an estate file, aligned with the precision of a thing designed to align. Lawrence sat with this for a long time. He was not, he would always maintain, an unreasonable man. He examined evidence, he followed logic to its conclusion, and the conclusion, assembled from the corridor, from the hidden letter, from the banking record now open on his desk, arrived with the quiet, terrible certainty of a column of figures that had finished summing itself. She had been placed here, not discovered, placed. He found her in the archive, naturally, where she always was, surrounded by the documents she had spent weeks arranging with such admirable thoroughness he now understood differently, rearranged by new information into a shape that made his chest feel like something load-bearing had shifted inside it. He laid the banking record on her reading table without preamble. "Explain this." Lady Mary looked at it. Something moved briefly across her face, not guilt, though Lawrence was too far inside his own certainty to read it accurately. And then she looked up at him with the steady grey eyes that had, until this morning, struck him as honest. "Lawrence, you will address me as your Grace," he said, and his voice was granite all the way through, cold and without seam, "and you will be gone from the archive by morning."
She was gone by morning as instructed. She left no note, no protest recorded in writing, no final appeal slid beneath his study door in the night. The West Wing was exactly as it had been before she occupied it, with the exception of the archive, which she had left in a state of such immaculate organization that it took Lawrence 3 days to realize he could not read it. The system she had built was not immediately apparent as a system. It presented itself as simple tidiness, documents filed, shelves labeled, cross-references noted in her precise small hand on index cards organized in a wooden table on the center table. It was only when Lawrence attempted to locate the Fenwick Land Survey on the morning of the 4th day for a meeting with the estate solicitor that could not be postponed that he understood he was not looking at tidiness. He was looking at architecture. Intricate, considered, and built entirely inside another person's logic. He spent 40 minutes searching before he found it misfiled, not by Lady Mary, he realized, with a cold settling in his stomach, but by himself a month prior, before she had reorganized the system entirely. She had found his error, corrected it silently, and said nothing to him. The index card in her handwriting noted in neutral documentary language that the survey had been relocated from an incorrect classification to its accurate position, with a date and a brief explanatory note that assumed no blame and assigned no fault. It was an act of extraordinary professional restraint. Lawrence set the survey on the table and stood very still for a moment. He returned to the estate accounts that week with the intention of demonstrating to himself that the management of Crestmore required no assistance beyond his own. He found the first discrepancy on Wednesday, a contractor's invoice that did not match the delivery record, the kind of small, calculated overcharge that accumulated into significant loss when left unexamined across a year of similar invoices. He found the correction notation in the margin in familiar, precise handwriting. She had caught it weeks ago and said nothing to him about it. He found 4 more by Friday. On Saturday, he discovered that the correspondence with the Northern Tenant Farms, which he had believed current, had fallen 6 weeks behind, and that Lady Mary had been maintaining it independently, drafting responses in neutral administrative language and leaving them on the correspondence tray for his signature each morning, which he had been signing without reading because she had never given him reason to read carefully.
Lawrence sat at his desk as the October light faded from the windows and looked at the accumulated evidence of what he had expelled from his house. Not a spy, not a liability, a partner, working quietly inside the cold machinery of his estate, correcting what he missed, maintaining what he neglected, asking for nothing and receiving, in return, his suspicion and his contempt. The silence of the West Wing was never louder.
They arrived on a Thursday morning, which was, Lawrence would note with grim retrospect, an entirely appropriate day for an ambush. Lord Ashford came first, in a carriage bearing his family crest, with the ostentatious confidence of a man who had already mentally redecorated the property he was arriving to claim. Baron Whitmore followed in a separate vehicle, which told Lawrence everything about the nature of their partnership, close enough to coordinate, distant enough to deny. Behind them, a third carriage, bearing the seal of the Chancery Court, delivered two officials in dark wool, who carried leather cases with the sober efficiency of men paid to finalize things other men had arranged. Lawrence received them in the great hall, because there was nowhere else to receive something of this scale, and because, retreating to a smaller room, would have suggested, correctly, that he was not entirely prepared for what was happening. He was not entirely prepared for what was happening. Ashford presented the documentation with the restrained pleasure of a man who had been rehearsing this moment for some time, the blood oath, the default clause, a chancery opinion obtained 3 weeks prior, confirming the debt's legal validity and the estate's liability. The officials opened their cases. The language was procedural, which made it worse. There was no drama to push against, only process, moving forward with the indifferent momentum of a tide that had already decided where it was going. "You have until noon," one of the officials said, not unkindly, "to produce evidence of settlement or legal nullification. Failing that, we will begin the inventory." Lawrence looked at Ashford, who was examining the ceiling with the proprietary interest of a man estimating renovation costs. It was at this precise moment that the front doors opened behind them. No one had knocked. The doors simply opened, admitting a rectangle of grey October light, and within it Lady Mary D. Mackintosh, Duchess of Crestmore, carrying her document case with the composure of a woman who had not travelled through the night and arrived with 20 minutes to spare and a great deal riding on the next several moments. She walked the length of the great hall without hurrying, which took considerable nerve, and set her document case on the table beside the Chancery officials' leather portfolios with a precision that suggested she had been imagining exactly this placement for some time. "I believe," she said, addressing the officials directly and only the officials, "that you will want to examine this before proceeding." She produced a single document, aged paper, different ink to the oath, bearing a legal seal that one of the officials leaned forward to examine with sudden sharpened attention. A codicil, drafted 14 months after the blood oath signing, executed by the same parties and witnessed by a King's Counsel whose signature carried a weight that made the second official reach for his reference volume without being asked. The codicil nullified the debt entirely. Ashford's composure left him first, quietly, like air from a punctured thing. Lawrence looked at his wife across the table. She had not yet looked at him. The officials left by early afternoon. Ashford and Whitmore departed some minutes before them, which spared everyone the indignity of a shared exit. Ashford said nothing on his way out, which was, Lawrence considered, the most honest thing the man had managed across the entire acquaintance. The carriages rolled down the Crestmore Drive and disappeared into the grey October middle distance, and then the house was quiet again, the specific quiet of a space that has just survived something and has not yet decided how to feel about the survival. Lady Mary was still at the table, returning documents to her case with the methodical calm she applied to everything, when Lawrence dismissed the remaining staff from the great hall with a word and a look that required no elaboration.
He stood for a moment in the silence she had created simply by being present inside it. "The banking record," he said finally. It was not an opening, it was not an apology. It was a man who had built his entire life on the precise examination of evidence, acknowledging without ceremony that he had examined it badly. "The deposits were from your own inheritance. My mother's estate settled that quarter. The account is 20 years old. I opened it at 16. She closed the document case. "The reference codes you matched to Ashford's solicitor numbering are a standard notation used by that banking house across all their accounts. It is printed in their charter, which is publicly available." Lawrence absorbed this with the stillness of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already, in the long, honest nights of the past 2 weeks, worked out for himself. "I was wrong," he said. She looked at him then, directly, with those gray eyes that had never once offered him anything other than exactly what was true. She did not say, "Yes, you were," and she did not say, "It doesn't matter," because she was not a woman who trafficked in either false generosity or unnecessary cruelty. "You were afraid," she said simply. "You have been afraid since before I arrived. I understood that. What I could not absorb was being punished for it." Lawrence crossed the hall and stood on the opposite side of the table, close enough that this was no longer a formal conversation, not so close as to presume a forgiveness not yet granted. "The banking record," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke, the way one works out a calculation that had resisted solution for years. It was not that he felt things, it was that he could not distinguish between people who deserved his trust and people who consumed it. Lady Mary was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now," Lawrence said, "I believe I can." He extended his hand across the table, not romantically, not dramatically, but with the deliberate, considered gesture of a man offering a contract he actually intended to honor. Lady Mary looked at it. Then she placed her hand in his with the calm of someone who had already decided some time ago to stay. Outside, the October light shifted. Somewhere in the West Wing, the archive waited, full of order, full of truth, full of the quiet architecture of a partnership that had been real long before either of them had named it. Crestmore Manor settled around them, and for the first time in 11 years, the silence felt less like absence and more like peace. To every reader who found this story from across an ocean, a time zone, or a sleepless night, thank you for staying. Lawrence and Mary did not make it easy, and neither did we. But you remained, chapter by chapter, through the cold wings and the forged debts and the long silences, and that faithfulness means more than any word count can measure. Stories only breathe because someone chooses to keep reading. You chose. We are grateful.